feel that there is nothing peculiar to the protagonists that singles them out for supernatural violation, coxxv. In other words, we are all vulnerable to being haunted by our own kind of ghost. The physical presence of the ghost in the story Turn of the Screw by Henry James is but a representative figure for our own psychological haunts. Characters list. The governess is the primary narrator and central character in the Turn of the Screw. She is 20 years old and was raised in Hampshire, the youngest daughter of a poor clergyman. From the stories she tells her young charges, we know that she had many sisters and brothers, as well as a dog. She has just left home when she interviews in London for the position of governess to 2 children in a country house in Essex. From the prologue, we know that she is smitten with her employer, and throughout the novel, she hopes to gain his respect or affection by succeeding at her job. The governess may be a loving, strong woman, whose struggle against the evil ghosts she encounters for the souls of the children in her care show her to be a good person. Or she may be mad, sexually repressed and delusional, imagining ghosts and evil that is not there, responsible for the destruction of young Flora and Miles. Mrs. Gross is the housekeeper at BLY. She was originally the maid of the gentleman in Harley Street's mother, and she has been responsible for little Flora since the death of Miss Jessel, the previous governess. She seems to be middle-aged but her age is never stated. She is illiterate, and as a servant, she is afraid of angering her employer by bothering him. She acts as a confidant to the narrator and seems to accept and believe her conclusions about the ghosts at BLY. Mrs. Gross is the only source of information we have about Peter Kint and Miss Jessel. Unlike the narrator, she wants to involve their employer early, but is unable to stand up to her superior. Flora 8 years old, Flora is the niece of BLY's owner. She is blonde and beautiful, capable of playing music and reciting poems, and a very friendly, docile child. The narrator first finds her angelic but later believes that at times she is an old woman. Flora was left alone with her former governess Miss Jessel for many months, and she may now be carrying on a secret communication with the woman's ghost. Her outer perfection and innocence may be real or it may conceal a greater evil. Miles 10 years old, Miles is away at school when the governess arrives at BLY. She finds him to be just as angelic and beautiful as his sister and says that he possesses a gentleness. Miles was expelled from his school for an unspecified offense. That and his other actions, such as going outside in the middle of the night, may mean he's simply a naughty little boy or it may mean he is clever and deviant. Miles spent a great deal of time with base menial servant Peter Kint and the governess suspects Kint's ghost of continuing to corrupt Miles. He is an excellent little gentleman, can play the piano, and his confrontations may result from a desire to get away from her and go to school or they may show Kint's control over him. Peter Kint was the gentleman in Harley Street's valet. Because he was ill, he was left in charge at BLY, where he would sometimes wear the master's clothes. He had curly red hair, red whiskers, sharp black eyes, and appeared handsome, but untrustworthy. When alive, Kint was a hound and had affairs with a number of women, including Miss Jessel, a woman above his station. He died by slipping on an icy path when drunk. As a ghost or possibly a hallucination, Kint appears to the governess and seems to want Miles's soul. Kint may also be a representation of the 19th century stereotype of the sexually predatory male. Miss Jessel was the children's former governess. Like the current governess, she was young and pretty. She seems to have had an affair with Kint and may have gotten pregnant. Miss Jessel died while away for her holiday and may have committed suicide. As a ghost, she appears wearing black and is often mournful. The governess believes that she wants Flora's soul and says that she speaks of suffering the torments of hell and wanting the child to suffer them with her. Miss Jessel in many ways parallels the governess and may be a projection of her fears. The gentleman in Harley Street, also referred to as the master and the uncle, he is the owner of BLY and the uncle of Flora and Miles, whose parents died in India. He is a young, attractive man who uses his power over the governess, and other women, to get them to agree to his demands. He is absorbed in his own affairs and refuses to allow the governess to contact him at all about the children. In that sense, he is indirectly responsible for the events that befall the children at BLY. Luke is one of the servants, the only one given a name. He is charged with posting the governess's letter to the gentleman in Harley Street, but does not because Miles steals it first. Miles's final request is to see him. Servants BLY is inhabited by many servants, both maids and men. The governess once mistakes Miss Jessel for a maid. She also frequently worries that the servants will learn about the ghosts and tries to keep her suspicions from them. Douglas owns the manuscript which comprises the majority of the book and introduces the story of the governess in the book's prologue. Probably about 60, Douglas knew and was in love with the governess as a young man, when she was his sister's governess. This may bias his description of her. He has kept her manuscript in a locked drawer in his home for many decades. Narrator. Though little description is given, the narrator is one of many people present in a country house telling ghost stories on Christmas Eve. The prologue is told in first person from his point of view. He says that Douglas gave him the governess's manuscript before his death. Griffin, another member of the party in the prologue, Griffin tells us an unsuccessful ghost story about a little boy which inspires Douglas to tell his tale. Mrs. Griffin's wife, who surmises that Douglas was in love with the governess, after he introduces his story. Friends. Other guests at the country house where the ghost stories are told. All are impatient to hear Douglas's story, though some ladies must leave before he begins it. Introduction. The story had held us, round the fire, sufficiently breathless, but except the obvious remark that it was gruesome, as, on Christmas Eve in an old house, a strange tale should essentially be, I remember no comment uttered till somebody happened to say that it was the only case he had met in which such a visitation had fallen on a child. The case, I may mention, was that of an apparition in just such an old house as had gathered us for the occasion, an appearance, of a dreadful kind, to a little boy sleeping in the room with his mother and waking her up in the terror of it, waking her not to dissipate his dread and soothe him to sleep again, but to encounter also, herself, before she had succeeded in doing so, the same sight that had shaken him. It was this observation that drew from Douglas, not immediately, but later in the evening, a reply that had the interesting consequence to which I call attention. Someone else told a story not particularly effective, which I saw he was not following. This I took for a sign that he had himself something to produce and that we should only have to wait. We waited in fact till 2 nights later, but that same evening, before we scattered, he brought out what was in his mind. I quite agree, in regard to Griffin's ghost, or whatever it was, that its appearing first to the little boy, at so tender an age, adds a particular touch. But it's not the first occurrence of its charming kind that I know to have involved a child. If the child gives the effect another turn of the screw, what do you say to 2 children? We say, of course somebody exclaimed, that they give 2 turns. Also that we want to hear about them. I can see Douglas there before the fire, to which he had got up to present his back, looking down at his interlocutor with his hands in his pockets. Nobody but me, till now, has ever heard. It's quite too horrible. This, naturally, was declared by several voices to give the thing the utmost price, and our friend, with quiet art, prepared his triumph by turning his eyes over the rest of us and going on, "It's beyond everything. Nothing at all that I know touches it." For sheer terror. I remember asking. He seemed to say it was not so simple as that, to be really at a loss how to qualify it. He passed his hand over his eyes, made a little wincing grimace. "For dreadful, dreadfulness. Oh, how delicious," cried one of the women. He took no notice of her, he looked at me, but as if, instead of me, he saw what he spoke of. "For general uncanny ugliness and horror and pain." "Well then," I said, "just sit right down and begin." He turned round to the fire, gave a kick to a log, watched it an instant. Then as he faced us again, "I can't begin. I shall have to send to town." There was a unanimous groan at this, and much reproach, after which, in his preoccupied way, he explained. "The story's written. It's in a locked drawer, it has not been out for years. I could write to my man and enclose the key, he could send down the packet as he finds it. It was to me in particular that he appeared to propound this, appeared almost to appeal for aid, not to hesitate. He had broken a thickness of ice, the formation of many a winter, had had his reasons for a long silence. The others resented postponement, but it was just his scruples that charmed me. I adjured him to write by the first post and to agree with us for an early hearing. Then I asked him if the experience in question had been his own. To this his answer was prompt. "Oh, thank God, no." "And is the record yours? You took the thing down?"